All right, Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, talking South Carolina. The best way we know how to do that is to bring on Will Gunter from the all-new early game, 107.5 The Game in Columbia, South Carolina, right there in Gamecock country. So you've got a new defensive line coach here. You got John Scott Jr. You also have the very best or near the best recruit in a five-star in Zach Pickens coming in, who may actually make Scott eventually look very good at coaching his position. So some star power there at the defensive line spot.
It's a big year for South Carolina on the defensive line. I think that is where you see championships won. We can talk about Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence at Clemson and winning a national championship, but that program went to another level when they had Dexter Lawrence, or when they recruited Dexter Lawrence and Christian Wilkins, Cleveland Farrell, Austin Bryant, and they've had those guys roll through. It's not just those guys. You go back and you see Grady Jarrett and Vic Beasley. South Carolina's in the same boat. So when Steve Spurrier had his best teams, you had Marcus Lattimore, you had Alshon Jeffrey, you had Connor Shaw, but you had Jadeveon Clowney, you had Melvin Ingram, you had Cliff Matthews, you had Travian Robertson. I know I'm leaving people off. I've talked about this last few days, and I know I'm leaving other defensive linemen off. Kelsey Quarles was a very good one. You had defensive linemen. So last year was the first time I noticed South Carolina was going to play Georgia, and you looked at the South Carolina defensive line, and you went, man, that's a small group outside of Javon Kinlaw. And sure enough, Georgia just ran roughshod over them in the second half. That has to be fixed. Well, you have Javon Kinlaw back. He's not participating this spring, of course, because of an injury. You bring in a five-star recruit in Zach Pickens. You bring in another highly thought-of four-star recruit, Joseph Anderson. Kobe Smith is a big defensive tackle on the interior that's back as a senior. Kier Thomas is back for his 22nd year. He's finally a senior from what they're telling me. So you've got some depth. DJ Wanham at the defensive end position is back. They've got some depth all of a sudden. They've got some playmakers at that position. And you're right, John Scott Jr. inherits a position that's not the best in the league. Let's be perfectly clear about that. But it's closer to the top now than it is to the bottom. And in the SEC, you win with defensive line, and it's going to be fascinating to see how this line plays out here in 2019. And this spring, getting Zach Pickens and Joseph Anderson and those guys, those reps, with Javon Kinlaw being out, that's important, and being able to get those guys up to speed. When you look at playing run-first teams that can come in and flat out shove it down your throat like Clemson, like Georgia, like Alabama this coming year.
We talk about it all the time, Will. This program under Will Muschamp went from 3 wins to 6 to 9. You talk to people on the radio every day. I'm sure you get stopped constantly, and people are asking you, what about South Carolina? How good are they going to be this year? And then they give you their take. And I got to think that was very, very optimistic going into last season. But this was the first bump in the road, going from 9 wins to 7 wins. So what are the expectations? How are the fans reacting to the drop off in wins, and now going from where it was Georgia, and if anybody's going to take down Georgia, most people were thinking across the nation, well, that South Carolina game in week 2, versus now it's suddenly Georgia, Florida, and then everybody else, and South Carolina is just kind of in the mix.
Yeah, it's because of the schedule. When you're going to play 3 teams that are top 4 teams right off the bat. As a matter of fact, I think ESPN put out their way too early preseason game, and I want to say 5 of the games are against top 10 teams. You throw in Texas A&M, a trip to Texas A&M, and you throw in Florida in there. All of a sudden, your 2019 schedule, at least on paper, has 5 top 10 teams. And the South Carolina fans are realistic about that. Now, they get Florida at home. And look, South Carolina had Florida beat in the Swamp last year. All right, South Carolina had them beat and blew that one. South Carolina blew the Florida game and blew the Texas A&M game. There's just no question about that. They also got lucky to win the Missouri game. So, these things kind of even themselves out. But South Carolina blew those games. The expectation in 2019 is going to be, hey, at some point you got to beat Kentucky. You can't keep losing. You want to say you're better than Kentucky, you got to beat them. Is it realistic to expect to beat Clemson in 2019? I don't know. I think the general feeling I get is that in 2019, you've got what we consider the big three games: Georgia, Clemson, Alabama. 2 of those are at home. Alabama and Clemson are at home. Georgia's on the road. Throw Texas A&M in there because South Carolina's not beating Texas A&M. You've got to win one of those 4 games. You got to win one of those 4, and then you need to hold serve with everything else. You get Kentucky and Columbia. You get Florida and Columbia. Don't trip up and lose to Tennessee in Neyland Stadium in Jeremy Pruitt's second year. Obviously don't lose to Vanderbilt. You got a season opener against North Carolina and Mac Brown. Don't allow them to establish a foothold in an area you're trying to recruit and lose a game that you shouldn't lose to North Carolina in that season opener. So it's kind of a weird situation in which I think fans look at the record and say, "Hey, we could be 7-5," with losses to, Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, and then Florida's not bad, and we lose to Texas A&M, and be a pretty good football team. And there's no shame in that, but they want to see a step made against these big name teams. You got to get kind of that signature victory here in 2019.
I asked that question, Will, and I forgot about the schedule. Yeah, that schedule is brutal.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I also asked that, and you alluded to last season, and I'm remembering watching the fourth quarter of that Florida game thinking I'm the smartest guy on the planet because I took South Carolina not only with the points, but to pull off the upset for the big money play, and it was falling right into my lap, and then they just blew it in the last 4 or 5 minutes.
That's happened. That goes back to Jake Bentley. I don't put the Florida game on him. And he played pretty good in the Texas A&M game outside of that first quarter. Again, the Florida game was just, I think you felt like that was Will Muschamp reverting back to Will Muschamp of the Florida days, running the football when South Carolina was just going up and down the field against Dan Mullen's defense, conceivably as good as they were against Clemson. That first half against Florida was as good as the South Carolina offense looked all year. There's reason to believe. There's reason for optimism. The schedule, they're going to need to get a signature victory in 2019. It doesn't matter who. South Carolina fans will take any of it. Who cares? Alabama, Georgia, Clemson. Just get one of them. That's all people are asking for.